Our next speaker is Mark Abspoel, who is going to tell us about how we can use MPC to fight human trafficking.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. I'm Mark. I'm at Roseman Labs. Just to give you some context, you might not have heard the name. We're a relatively new MPC startup. We have a lot of cryptographers. Milo, Niels, Toon, and Barry are also at this conference today. And our goal is to enable computation on sensitive data. To do that, we unsurprisingly use MPC. I'm going to tell you about a project that we did, which was about fighting human trafficking. Now, human trafficking, it's an important problem. It's a large problem. It's also growing, and it's hard to fight. Law enforcement has limited insight into what's going on, making it hard to combat. This project we did together with the Sustainable Rescue Foundation, and their mission, and also the mission we had in common, was to use digital techniques to improve the fight against human trafficking. Now, this is difficult also because there are a lot of the topic is sensitive, but also the data at hand is quite sensitive. So there are a lot of privacy issues, which makes it, I guess, ideal for MPC. So the concrete, or sort of the context of the problem is that law enforcement wants to sort of get an idea of the network of human traffickers, but they typically don't know who the traffickers are, although they might have some idea of who the victims, the trafficked people are. So by surveilling the potential victims, they might lead them to the traffickers. So in this playing field, there are also some victims that turn to NGOs for aid. The NGOs, they try to help the victims the best way they can. When a victim approaches an NGO for aid, this is I mean, this doesn't happen. This happens, but not by far. By far, there are a lot more victims that are not known to these NGOs. The NGOs would like to keep in contact with these victims so that they can help them better. But they fear that if the law enforcement agency actually decides to surveil these victims that are known to the NGOs, or maybe even approach them for an interview, then the victims will get scared. They think that it's because they talk to the NGO that the law enforcement knows about them, and they might go off grid. And the NGOs will no longer be able to help them. So we need a secure way to combine data. We have a law enforcement agency that has a list of these potential victims of human trafficking. And also the NGOs, they have a list of victims that they are supplying aid to. And the law enforcement agency, I mean, they have a large list of potential victims, and they would like to do some surveillance, but it's okay for them to get a small sample. Because they also have limited resources. So in this case, we would like the law enforcement agency to get a sample of these potential victims that they have, excluding the victims that are receiving aid. So concretely, we have two sets, and we would like to get a small sample from the set difference. One additional challenge is that in these lists of names, the names might be spelled slightly differently, even though they refer to the same person. So we need to take that into account. Also, I mean, maybe for obvious reasons, there are mutual privacy requirements. The law enforcement agency does not want to give their list of potential victims to the NGOs, maybe for obvious reasons. And the NGOs also don't want to supply their known, the people they're supplying aid to the law enforcement agency, making it, I guess, ideal for MPC. So we decided on a very simple algorithm. I'm sure lots of you can come up with the same thing. We have these lists. So one inclusion list from the law enforcement agency and 2 exclusion lists that are, we take the union of them from the NGOs. We secret share all of these input lists, and we randomly permute the inclusion lists. And then for each name in the inclusion list, we're going to check whether this name, obliviously, matches any of the exclusion lists. We publicly output whether this there is a match. If there is no match, so this name is not included in any of the exclusion lists, then we output this name towards the law enforcement agency. We terminate when the desired number of names have been outputted. Now, this does reveal some information, namely the lengths of the lists, and also there are some. Everyone sees a number which is the overlap between the exclusion list and a random sample of the inclusion lists. Basically, the number of steps after which this algorithm terminates. But this is limited information, and since this is only run once, it was determined that this was acceptable. Now to go into the how do we tackle these names that might be spelled differently. So prior to this, we know that all of the names are from a single country of origin. So what we did is we used word2vec-like algorithm trained on a language model that these names sort of are in the same country of, to learn a vector representation of these names. So we get some vector with real values between 0 and 1 of some length, and then similar names. So my name is actually also hard for Dutch people. Always have to spell it. People usually think there's a P at the second entry or something. So this name, Abspoel spelled with a B or P, would be the vector representations would be very close. But if you have a different name like Schoenmakers, the vector would be very different. So we can gauge whether 2 names are similar by looking at the angle between their vectors, or in other words, we take an inner product between the 2 vectors, which, as we know, is cheap in MPC. And if this inner product is greater than from some threshold t, then we say, okay, these names are equal. They refer to the same person. So now that we have this algorithm, we can implement it. We use very straightforward, simple techniques: passive security, Shamir secret sharing, honest majority, BGW style. We did all of these computations on the integers, so we don't use floating point numbers for these word vectors. Everything modulo a large prime. To give you an idea of the parameter sizes, this inclusion list was hundreds of names, and these exclusion lists on the order of tens of names. Now, one thing when you do MPC is that this input data is absolutely essential. We're going to set it up in a way such that employees of ours, of Roseman Labs, they were going to run the MPC, but they shouldn't be able to see the actual data, which made it sort of hard for us. Like, how do we verify that the data is in the correct format? So before this, we made some tool where we could just feed it. I mean, the program is going to take just a list of plain text names separated by a new line. So we made this tool where we replace all of the strings of alpha and numeric characters with sets of 4 asterisks. So we are able to sort of inspect the data for any formatting issues before feeding it into the MPC code. And this turned out to be quite useful. So after we have this code, how are we going to put it into practice? Well, we did a ceremony. This was a once-off thing. It was orchestrated remotely at 3 locations. We had this 1 law enforcement agency and 2 NGOs. At each location, there was 1 employee of ours present as well, 2 laptops, or actually there were even 3 laptops because everyone was connected through a video conference call as well. So we had the input party, we had the MPC node, and we had the video conference. And there were also some other project partners also for auditability purposes. We had this MPC running on a sort of like a relatively fresh laptop with the MPC code running inside a virtual machine. All of these MPC laptops, they were connected through a 4G dongle with a VPN. I mean, this wasn't technically necessary. We could have used their Wi-Fi because the connections are encrypted anyway. But I mean, for availability of the connection, this was decided to be a good thing. We transferred inputs from the input party to the MPC laptop using a USB drive fresh from the packaging, so that they could see that we weren't infecting them with our malware or anything. Prior to running the ceremony, we had a protocol written out, like not an MPC protocol, but was just a text-based, a list of steps that we were going to execute in the protocol. And these were written in a way so that they were also intelligible to the people that were actually representing the input parties. So they could follow along, basically. And after every step, we signed them off just on paper, both the input party representative and our representative. We made screen recordings of the MPC laptops, and also we recorded video conference so that everything was auditable after the fact. We kept logs of this and also code snapshots. For all of this, we did a trial run 2 weeks before with fake data, just to smooth out any final issues. Now, even before we did this ceremony, there were some questions of whether this was actually legal, whether we could actually do this project. Now, as we know in the EU, the GDPR protects personal data, of course, it's a very good thing. But one challenge was, so to do any processing under the GDPR, you require a legal basis. And usually this legal basis is consent of the data subject. But for the law enforcement agency, they actually have a different legal basis which they operate under, which is their sort of investigative mandate, executing a public task. So in this case, we have this joint processing, but there is a mixed legal basis. It's consent from the data subjects for the NGOs, but law enforcement agency, they use a different legal basis. So the question was, can we actually mix these legal bases and still do joint processing? After some legal analysis, it was determined that this was indeed the case. We could do this. But also there's a requirement for that the consent of the data subject has to be informed. So what we did, for example, this, I mean, you have to sort of explain what MPC is, but you also have to explain this fuzzy matching, like what are the risks involved here? So this is one sort of graphic we used to explain to the NGOs, which would then explain them to the data subjects. And we have this parameter, this threshold parameter, which decides whether two names are considered to be the same. If we set this threshold to be relatively loose, that means that we have a low risk of false negatives, and false negatives is really what we want to avoid, which is that that might result in an aid-receiving victim to end up on this in this sample, which we want to avoid. So by setting this threshold loose enough, we get a very low risk of false negatives, and we might get some false positives, but as long as the sample is big enough, then we don't care about this. One thing that we found is that MPC doesn't help you to get around the GDPR. You're still doing processing on personal data, so the GDPR applies. But what MPC does help you with is that the GDPR has a lot of abstract notions that you also need to satisfy in order to do data processing. I mean, you see them on the slide, stuff like purpose binding, data minimization, good technical measures to protect data. And when you use MPC, you actually satisfy all of these sort of automatically and in a very strictly defined way. Like these notions that are abstract in the GDPR, in MPC, it becomes very concrete. So when you do a data processing impact assessment, these DPIAs, before doing any processing, when you use MPC, a lot of these things, they are reusable from one project to the next, just by the fact that you use MPC and these things are automatically filled in. So that's a big advantage because it basically cuts down on the attention to legal matters that you have to devote to the project. The results, we executed the ceremony. It was a success. The law enforcement agency received a sample of names. Everything was done relatively quickly, especially if you compare to the projects in academia. It can take a while. We did everything in 6 weeks. This was a one-off design, so we did the ceremony just as a single occasion, and we're in talks to turn this into a more ongoing thing where we don't need to execute the ceremony manually every time. Some takeaways from the project. It takes more than just an MPC protocol to make things work. I mean, this project involved a lot of people that are absolutely non-technical, and they need to understand what's going on. So we need to explain the functionality, the limitations of MPC. And also, when it comes to the security of information, MPC is just a small part. We basically need this entire chain of secure hardware, software, and everything. We want everything to be auditable at every step. The legal complexity is greatly reduced when using MPC. As I said, we automatically satisfy many notions of this GDPR, and we can reuse this DPIA. And also, input data quality is very important. I showed you this inspection tool. This allows us to solve an issue at the last possible moment that didn't turn up in the trial run. Stuff to watch out for includes encodings like UTF-8 versus UTF-16 on Windows versus Linux, line endings, stuff like this. Small issues which you typically don't care about as a researcher, but which are very important when you want to run this in practice. And I can advise you when you do projects like this, use lots of sanity checks on your data, because that's eventually what determines whether the output is going to be garbage or not. That was my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Questions? Should we get you a mic? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll speak loud.
Okay.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Super cool to see a project like this. I'm wondering, a very boring, non-technical question. How did you manage to get those NGOs and law enforcement to want to take part in this project? How do you even get them to talk to them? That's
Yeah. So the question was, how do we get the law enforcement agency and NGOs to actually want to participate in this project? Yeah, this is also not my area of expertise, I have to say. Luckily, we have people in our company that are very good at this. That have, I think it's very important to have a wide network where you are closely, you get in contact quite quickly with people that are high up in these organizations, and then it's a matter of just explaining technique to them, explain what you do, go into what they need, and just try to see if you can find this mutual gain.
Hey, thanks for the talk so much. It's quite amazing work. I have a similar question, which you might also not technical. Was it easy to explain MPC to NGOs, to a layman, without a lot of hand waving?
So the question was whether it was easy to explain MPC to these NGOs and non-technical people. Well, I do notice that it gets easier every time you do it. Basically, you start off with this very indeed hand wavy explanation. I mean, I'm sure you probably know when you try to explain MPC to a stranger you meet or your friends. Every time you do it, you sort of like you hear the questions that come back, and you're able to anticipate them, and your explanation becomes more concise and indeed less hand wavy. So yeah, it's doable, but sometimes you have to take some shortcuts, of course. But find out what's important for the listener to understand.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Very cool work, especially because like in this kind of security situation, the time is probably critical, because what this human behavior do is to move the victims from country to country. My question is the following: so from this 6 weeks, for the first time you managed to do this ceremony and stuff, how can you reduce that? And what are your plans to follow up on this and try to, I don't know, make it part of a bigger operation?
Yeah. So thanks. The question was like, how can we reduce this 6 weeks time, because the time is probably essential. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of of these 6 weeks went into actually sort of figuring out what was needed and implementing that, putting it into practice. I mean, a lot of this stuff. So we did this as a one-stop ceremony. If we were to do this ceremony again, we could probably set it up in less than a week because we already have implementation. But we're also trying to make this sort of an ongoing thing where we don't even need to do this ceremony manually. But yeah, that requires integrating into existing infrastructures. Which is a harder problem, but this is something that is very much in the pipeline to make things faster. Yeah, and how we do that, yeah, I guess that it becomes a different issue almost, like how to integrate into this infrastructure.
All right, guys, we're a little bit behind, so let's thank Mark again. Before you guys go, quick announcements. So we took a poll about who wants a beautiful TPMPC poster to take home, and a lot of people raised their hands. And these posters are now ready to be picked up at the registration desk. So see you guys in 25 minutes. For remembering to repeat the questions. Great job.
Thanks.